And we sort of settled on ground stations in South America because there had been some media coverage of it, but it didn't tell the full story, right? You'd see a little thing here, a little thing there, and it kind of hinted at some stuff, but it didn't really explain it. And as I'm sure we'll get into on the podcast, when we're dealing with China, there's a lot of layers you got to peel back to understand what's going on here.
From the Defense and Aerospace Report, this is The Downlink, a podcast about the intersection of space, the space business, and defense. Not just what's over the horizon, but what's happening above it. I'm your host, Laura Winter. Hello, and welcome back to The Downlink. This week's episode is part 2 of the Great Ground Game. If you haven't yet, please listen to part 1. It's about the ground stations the U.S. and NATO use in the high north. That's near or inside the Arctic Circle. That episode shows just what these ground stations do for national and regional security, who owns them, and their vulnerabilities. In this episode, we're going to look at China's ground stations in the region that the U.S. has traditionally seen as its sphere of influence, South America. At least officially, the U.S. Department of Defense does not seem to utilize ground stations located in South America, but NASA does. NASA uses a commercially owned ground station facility located in Santiago, Chile. Now, remember this location because it's going to come up in the discussion. Santiago Station is part of NASA's Near Space Network and its Deep Space Network. These networks are used to send telemetry, tracking, and command signals, or TT&C, to spacecraft on orbit or well beyond, and to receive signals from spacecraft. That's called payload data transmission, or PDT. There's a reason I'm using NASA as an example. We know what NASA is using these ground stations for, exploration and scientific missions, because the space agency is run by civilians, and when it does work with the Department of Defense or the commercial sector, the terms of those agreements or contracts are relatively transparent. China's space ecosystem just doesn't work that way. And because of that, the roughly dozen or so ground stations Chinese entities have access to or wholly manage in South America have caused some in defense circles concern. To explain the state of play here, I spoke with Matthew Funaiole and Brian Hart from the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Here's our conversation. Hi, Matthew. Brian, thank you for coming on the Downlink.
Hi, Laura. It's great to be here.
Yeah, it's good to be here.
You know, before we dive into what's happening south of the equator, this is your first time on the podcast. So it would be great if you could take a moment and introduce yourselves. And Matthew, why don't you go first?
Thanks so much. Happy to. So I am a senior fellow at CSIS with the China Power Project, and I'm also vice president for our Ideas Lab, which is a kind of interesting sort of different thing that we have at CSIS that a lot of other think tanks don't have. It's on one hand our in-house multimedia studio, but it's also our incubation for new ideas, right? So we're trying to innovate in a new space, try satellite imagery, try out data analysis, figure out all these different things. That goes through our Ideas Lab as well. So I lead that, and also a senior fellow with our China Power Project, which Brian is also a part of.
And Brian, what are you doing at CSIS? And maybe you want to explain the China Power Project that you're working on as well.
Yeah, so as Matthew said, I'm a fellow with China Power. So our program is largely focused. It's actually one of 3 different programs at CSIS that focuses on China. So we kind of have a pretty large remit. We look at all different elements of Chinese power. We have a microsite at chinapower.csis.org. And you know, we look at economic power, military power, lots of different elements of China's national power. But my own personal focus and interest are most heavily in Chinese foreign policy, Chinese military modernization, and kind of U.S.-China technological competition. So a lot of what we're going to talk about today is all the stuff I love to talk about.
Excellent. And see, as today we're going to be talking about ground stations in South America. Isn't this part of some sort of larger project?
It is, yeah. So it's a new initiative that we stood up at CSIS toward the end of last year. It's called Hidden Reach. So it's supposed to have kind of an exciting name, right? What are Hidden Reach? What does that mean? What are we
It's
trying
always
to?
fun to be cool.
Yeah, we spent a lot of time, we spent more time than you'd want to know trying to figure out what the name was going to be for this. So what's Hidden Reach? Well, there's a ton of conversation about China, right? Everyone's talking about China, and some issues get a ton of attention, right? Taiwan, right? Everyone talks about Taiwan. Everyone talks about cross-strait. But in the process of us, focusing so much on China and U.S.-China relations and what it means for the United States, we've lost sight of a lot of the facets that are really, really important about how global dynamics are changing, right? There's a lot of underappreciated elements in relation to China, China's influence, how it interacts with other countries that aren't necessarily the United States, that I don't think we don't have a good sense of what that looks like. And so Hidden Reach is trying to understand these underappreciated elements of China's international influence and bring that to light. And it touches on a number of different things. It touches on some things that are highly technical. It touches on things that maybe are related to some issues that people are familiar with, like infrastructure development. But what we're trying to do with the project is really cast a wide net to understand what it is people are talking about, what information is out there, and then weave together a narrative that helps piece together all these different pieces, right? You have one thing from like a technical article, one thing from a Chinese language source, something that the US government said at one point in time. How do you line these all up to tell a story that actually arrives at a place where we have a better understanding of what China's doing and how its influence is growing and what that means for both the US, but also our allies and partners around the globe?
Yeah, but you started with like ground stations for
Yeah,
space. I mean, what inspired you to research this topic? And well, did anything surprise you?
I think for one, we wanted to challenge ourselves, right? If you look and see what people are talking about for China, it's easy to default to going, straight into the military with your sort of first issue. And we thought, okay, what's something that people have talked about in the past, but is difficult for people to grasp and understand? And we sort of settled on ground stations in South America because there had been some media coverage of it, but it didn't tell the full story, right? You'd see a little thing here, a little thing there, and it kind of hinted at some stuff, but it didn't really explain it. And as I'm sure we'll get into on the podcast, when we're dealing with China, there's a lot of layers you got to peel back to understand what's going on here. So I think we just got fascinated by, okay, well, let's look at this. Let's spend some time, look at it. Let's try to understand, what's going on. And I think in the process, some of the things that really stood out to us as far as like big picture takeaways is, first off, China has this thrust of becoming very much a space power, but that's not necessarily totally different than how a country like the United States or how some of our European partners think about the role that space plays in information or in its defense or just in scientific exploration and in the civilian space. So that's one part that oftentimes gets missed. But the other aspect that really comes out of the research is that whereas the United States oftentimes will partner with other countries overseas as far as our space agenda is concerned, there's more transparency and trust in those relationships, and that's founded in a lot of different institutions and engagements. But for China, it's new to the game, so it's still sort of getting its feet wet, trying to figure out exactly how it forms these partnerships overseas. And in the process, there's a lot of things that leave questions, right? Leave questions about how much the host governments really understand about what's going on at these ground stations. Brian, I don't know if you want to jump in on that.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things that drove us to focus on this is, I think, the dual use nature of a lot of how space works.
Yeah, for sure.
And I think that's why people miss a lot of what how China might be gaining influence or achieving its objectives in the military realm by engaging in commercial or civilian activities. And so when you unpack a lot of that, you kind of get at the center of China's strategy and some of the tactics that they really like to use, whether that's in space or in other realms. And so I think this is a really good microcosm of a lot of what future Hidden Reach research will look like in terms of how China blends together its activities to achieve a lot of different objectives at the same time.
Last week we had a discussion about the ground stations used for defense and intelligence in the high north. Who's there, the types of security risks, and what needs battening down. Now, South America is completely different. Does the U.S. have ground stations in South America? I looked and I didn't find any. Or perhaps maybe I should just ask, who has ground stations there? China certainly does.
Yeah, I mean that's actually, I mean, it's funny that you bring it up because this is one of the places that we actually struggled quite a bit in mapping out what the environment looks like, right? So normally when you're doing some research and you're sort of going about the what's China doing, what's the United States doing, it's usually pretty easy to get a full map of what how the United States is interacting in an environment. But when we were looking through South America, really there wasn't as much information as we thought there would be. So one example, I'll sort of give you a sort of specific example. We'll probably talking a little bit about the Santiago station, right? And that's one that SSC operates, and that China had a contract there for a large period of time. Well, NASA and the European Space Agency ESA, they've also leased facilities there, right? And it's interesting to think about in this environment of South America, trying to get coverage over the skies over South America, having a Swedish commercial entity operating a ground station, and you have NASA using it at times, you have ESA using it at times, you also have China in the past having used it as well. So it's a very interesting environment. One sort of thing to also keep in mind is that when it comes to space, which I think in a lot of cases it can get into the sort of sensitive area very quickly. The U.S. is more inclined to partner with some of its more traditional sort of intelligence partners, right? Like those are really the countries it looks at. So if you think about Southern Hemisphere coverage, a place like Australia is really where you'd see the U.S. having a lot of collaboration because we have those kind of agreements already in place.
So, before we start discussing China's footprint in South America, I think the audience would really benefit from an illustration of just how the Chinese space ecosystem works. The relationships between the People's Liberation Army's Strategic Support Force, the China National Space Administration, state owned space enterprises, and finally, the Chinese, and here are air quotes, private space sector. Brian, why don't you take that on?
Yeah, sure. So I think starting off, I think it's important to understand that the Chinese space ecosystem is very different from the US ecosystem. They think about it in a different way. So if you think about US ecosystem, you have NASA leading a lot of these large civilian scientific projects, and they're partnering with US private enterprises like Boeing to create space equipment. Whereas in China, their system is very different. It's very state led. So you have NASA's official counterpart in China is the China National Space Administration, but the CNSA is very weak in terms of its overall influence on the ecosystem. It's largely plays a bureaucratic role, and it plays a role in some of the official international cooperation. But by and large, the ecosystem in China is really run by a tight network of very large state-owned enterprises, and also by the Chinese military, the PLA. And so that ecosystem is why we have so many concerns about what China is doing abroad, because you have these close networks where so a couple of years ago, as part of these larger reforms, China set up the PLA Strategic Support Force, and within that, the SSF kind of is in charge of space, but also information systems. And so the space component of that is really where the PLA is involved in launching Chinese rockets and in maintaining and tracking Chinese satellites, and also helps to launch the PLA and some of these other SOEs within China help to launch other countries' satellites and help design their satellites too, especially for developing countries that don't have their own access to space.
And
So
if I could just interrupt you for a moment, I mean, when we were talking about information operations, I mean, the Strategic Support Force is also involved in fielding systems that can also gather information too, as well, no?
Yeah, and so actually, there's still a lot of ongoing research into just exactly what organizations within the Strategic Support Force are in charge of what things. A lot of their reforms that were launched around 2016 have still not been fully fleshed out in the open space, but we know that Chinese hackers and Chinese information systems experts are working for the Strategic Support Force to help them to collect overseas intelligence, SIGINT, comment, and things like that. And that's closely interwoven with the same overall system that's supporting China's space systems. And so they kind of go hand in hand in terms of supporting the PLA with things like military intelligence, but also space situational awareness and on the ground situational awareness too. So that this really is a larger part of their whole ecosystem. I mean, the U.S. has its own space force, which was actually set up after China launched its reforms and set up the strategic support force. So I think there's a broader move, within different militaries to focus more on space. But I think China was really proactive in starting these reforms. And again, their ecosystem is really tightly controlled by the PLA and these state-owned enterprises.
Can I two finger on something on that? Because I just
Of
think it's a
course.
fascinating topic. So, one of the things that we spend a lot of time joking about when we're digging into these research projects is that the frame of reference in which the discourse in the U.S. is often talked about is entirely wrong. Right? It's a wrong frame of reference. Like we look at how the relationship between NASA and the U.S. military and how that's evolved and changed over time. And I think there's a tendency to take that approach and apply it to China and say, okay, well, if it's outside of this box of how we think things are supposed to be structured, China's doing it different, and for what purpose is it doing it? And those are questions you should ask, right? We should be exploring and trying to understand that. But how China thinks about civil military relations is fundamentally different than how the U.S. thinks about civil military relations. And so you get in these instances where you have a different frame for understanding and organizing what it is that you're trying to do. And then you're also faced with an environment where we have an imperfect information space. So it can lead you to go down all these different paths, right? There, things are, I guess, open to interpretation in that sense. So it takes a lot of effort to try to weed through and get at the heart of it. And I think, Brian, laying it out helps to get a sense of how different it really is compared to how we might think about things here in the US. And that's just really foundational context for any type of analysis you're doing in relation to China.
Let me see if I could just boil all this down to a fine point, though. And I'll ask Brian this. Brian, is there any space entity that isn't in some way controlled by the People's Liberation Army?
So this is a good question. And within China, they are really trying to push, on paper, they're trying to push, and in practice to some extent, to set up a commercial space industry that is, doing commercial space launches similar to kind of how SpaceX has been doing it. But no company in China is close to getting to a place like SpaceX. And in fact, the most successful commercial enterprises in China within their commercial space ecosystem really a lot of them are actually spin-offs of these state-owned enterprises. And so they still have these close linkages with these SOEs, and they still have these ties to the state and to the party. So even in this space, which I think they are trying to innovate in, they're trying to be on the leading edge on the commercial end, they're still not there yet. And still the overall, the ecosystem continues to be dominated by the state and the party and the military.
In your report, you guys squarely focus on a controversial ground station project in Argentina, the Espacio Lejano ground station in Neuquén, maybe I'm saying it wrong. Sorry, everybody. But from what I understand, this project has been controversial from the start, and that I think was in 2012 for local Argentinians as well as for the U.S. Department of Defense. What is the story here?
It's a great question. In the opening, we sort of alluded to there had been some media coverage, and then it kind of disappeared. So we spent a really long time trying to dig into the specifics here and get a sense of what's going on. And there's a few different layers to what it is that I think we've kind of worked through. So one is that there's the actual contract that China has with the Argentine government, and how that lays out what this relationship is going to look like. So there's a land lease component to it, a large swath of land that China leased that the station itself is only a small portion of that, but a larger space. And so there's questions about, is this going to be expanded, or why is there so much land that they lease there? We don't necessarily have a ton of insight on that part. But then in the specifics of the contract itself, there's phrasing and language to the point of the Argentine government can't interfere, or is not allowed to interfere with activities that are actually occurring at the ground station, and that starts to raise a lot of strange questions. Now,
That's sovereignty right there,
Yeah. I mean,
just to begin with.
it's also just it's strange, right? It's one of those things, where even with the best intention going into research as unbiased as possible, you start to go, well, that just feels weird. That doesn't sound right. And then you add on like, okay, well, how does the US do it? Like, how is it, partnering with other countries? And again, it gets back to the US working with a country like Australia, we have established systems for information sharing. So if there are some sensitive aspects there, that there's still a platform for sort of sharing. Then it's sort of this part of, well, what does Argentina get out of this arrangement, right? Okay, well, maybe at some point it strengthened ties with China and there might be some benefits there, but it doesn't seem from anything that we could tell, either from the research we conducted, and we did quite a few interviews talking to people about this as well, that they were really getting any type of information gain out of this environment. It was sort of this, and this is not my phrasing, it's what it gets talked about online as, but as a black box, right? Something's going on there. We don't necessarily know what's going on. And I think that just amplifies it, right? I don't want to, come out and make it seem as if everything that China is doing at every single one of its ground stations has some nefarious purpose or only supports what the PLA is trying to do. These ground stations are essential for China's goals, and a lot of those goals are scientific, a lot of those goals are civilian. But because we don't have any transparency into what kind of information is being collected or how the instruments at those sites are being used, because we know there are very, very close ties between the PLA and all of China's other space entities, it just leads you in a direction of, well, there has to be dual use application going on. The technologies is inherently dual use, and we don't have anything to point us in another direction. And all of that stuff. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Laura.
No, if you could like take a moment and just sort of explain, like, how can the ground station be dual use? I think there's a lot of people who probably, can operate satellites and stuff like that and think about orbits. But when we're actually talking about the ground, what is a dual use ground station? How does that work?
Yeah, so this is a great question. I know that Brian will want to jump in on some of this as well. All ground station, I'm going to go out and say, based off all the research that we did and every single person we talked to that was a technical expert, people that are, at MIT, people that are elsewhere, right? All ground stations are inherently dual use. It doesn't matter if they're a Chinese ground station or not, a Chinese used ground station or not. And the reason is that information is something that can easily be weaponized, right? You need to have telemetry information. You need to have tracking and command of your own assets in space, but the ability to do that doesn't preclude you from also tracking what other countries are doing in the space domain, right? So it starts to provide space situational awareness and what that looks like. Communications, you assume military communications are encrypted, and those are probably, if you were snooping, not something you might not want to glean a lot from. But that doesn't stop you from trying to use those assets to snoop on other types of communication as well. Where the line is that spying, or is that not spying? Is that information gathering, or what that falls into? That'd be more of a sort of case by case basis. But the technology itself just has the ability to do a lot of different things. Just on the comm side itself, the different bands that you can, operate on, right? They have both civilian and they have military applications, right? We use wireless communications for, I'm holding up my phone, right? For our phone, for Bluetooth, for all those different things. But the same band, right, on the radio spectrum can also be used for your airborne early warning detection systems and trying to understand what else is in your information space and in your information environment. So it's very much at the crux of understanding where information and potential military application overlap, and that's a lot of what's really going on here. And Brian, I know you probably have some stuff you want to jump in with on this as well.
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to tie back to what you said earlier, is that, in addition to this having dual use implications, it is important to stress, though, that it does definitely also serve scientific civilian purposes as well. And so we know that this ground station is part of China's deep space network, and it supported, to some extent, China's 2019, I think it was 2019, Chang'e for lunar rover mission. So we know it's been involved in this, and we know that they do need ground stations to support their space ambitions. Because in the past, actually, I think it was in 2013, in a previous mission that China launched in space, they actually had to rely on the Europeans to provide some tracking and technical support, just because they didn't have at the time the necessary technological capability in terms of global reach. And so for them, given their space ambitions and their desires to go further in space, to having gone to Mars now with the rover, they as they push out, they are going to need these kind of ground stations to support them, and in order to be independent, which is something that they definitely want.
Self-sufficiency is a big thing here, right? When we're thinking about China, like it does not want to have to rely on other countries, especially other countries that potentially have a technological advantage. And that's not something that's new. I think ever since the 95, 96 Taiwan Strait crisis, like China has really been focused on how does it ramp up its technological capabilities, and how does it technologically independent. The Taiwan Strait crisis reference there is kind of a like joke on people who spent too much time thinking about the PLA. Some of the missiles that were fired during the Taiwan Strait crisis missed their mark, I guess is what you could say. And the common understanding is that China lost access to the GPS system that they were dependent on, and this really started having them think about, okay, we need to have our own system in place so that we're not reliant on positioning from other countries or from other entities. It's again a thing about exposure and self-sufficiency.
I would also add they haven't had that many choices in terms of cooperating, because the United States has officially, with the Wolf Amendment that passed, I'm blanking on the exact year, but more than a decade old, the Wolf Amendment, it kind of really severely restricts U.S.-China cooperation on space issues because of fears of China stealing technology, or mostly concerns about stealing technology. But actually, that hasn't stopped them from pursuing their goals independently. And so that's really where China finds itself today, is they have these ambitions, and really the main way that they're going to get there is on their own, and that's the course they're pursuing.
Yeah, China's, this kind of goes along with it, because China has been kicked out of some ground stations, and perhaps that's too harsh of a term, but the Swedish Space Corporation declined to renew its Chinese contracts in 2020. And I believe they were for stations in South America, the high north, and also in Australia. What happened there?
It's a very polite way of ending the relationship with China, is not renewing the contract. It's a lovely, like, politically correct way of doing things. So China had a presence at Santiago for a long time, and when exactly it started, there's a little bit of a sort of murky question, because Santiago, previously part of it was operated by one of the universities in the area, and China sort of funded or supported what was going on there. But ever since SSC sort of took over and began operating at Santiago, China has had a place there, right? And as I mentioned earlier, other countries have also had a place there, and so they had a lease. And at some point, I don't remember when it was, over 10 years ago, they signed a 10-year lease to renew that contract and carrying it into the future. So that's the context of what that looked like. And as I said before, ESA, for instance, has used Santiago in the past. Well, I think it was 2019. There was the Swedish Defense Research Agency. I might have gotten that name wrong, but I think I
think that's what it is. Actually, I was reading it last night. Yeah.
I think that's what the name is. So they came out with a report and said, okay, well, very much in line with this sort of dual use and how we were just sort of framing how some of this technology could be used in other contexts. Well, China's could be violating the terms of its agreement to only use SSC facilities for civilian purposes to collect intelligence that's feeding into the military, right? It might be using it for military intelligence gathering purposes. And this wasn't even at Santiago, it was in Kiruna, the sort of, up Arctic circles in Sweden, that they had been leasing space from there as well. And so
it was imagery, I think it was, from Kiruna, right?
I think that's correct. And the report came out, and it was interesting because it wasn't an immediate move away. Like, there was this period where there was this information, this report came out, and SSC was like, well, we're going to look into it, but we have an agreement. We're a civilian agency where we don't do military intelligence gathering. and it kind of was in this flux period for a little bit. And then, a couple months later, they should have announced, well, we're not going to renew our ties with China. We're not going to renew the contract. And, I think that's very much, a factor of, that report came out and said your facilities could be used for other purposes. And I think SSE maybe needed some time to think through what that meant as far as their business model. I don't think there's anything nefarious going on with them. It's just they have to wrestle with this. And then also at the same time, and Brian, we were talking about this before we got on the podcast, the temperature on China has dramatically changed. And if you think about, so this happened in 2019. I think the contract ran maybe through 2020 or something like that.
It did.
And yeah, if you go back to China, let's go back to 2010. The way people talked about China was very different then, right? There was a lot of different, like, okay, well, China's this rising, power. How is it going to use that power? There was this. I remember seeing these like economist ads from around that time. There's like, is China a friend to the West? Is China, an enemy to the West? There's very, diametrically opposed conceptions of where we're headed on China. And so, there was a different environment then. So if you think there's this concern about dual use, a lack of transparency, and then on top of it, you have all of these questions and concerns about just China in a broader sense, outside of just the domain of space and the domain of using these ground stations, that really just colors things in a very, very different way. And there's no way to just sort of change that. That's the momentum of where we are right now, how we frame everything in relation to what we think about China.
Yeah, there is a bit of decoupling. I mean, if you look at today's headlines, which I did just before we all got together here, there are some headlines out there that I need to run down, but allegedly the European Space Agency is saying that their astronauts are not going to go up and visit the Chinese space station. So, yeah, definitely. Yeah, isn't it? Yeah. And when I looked at your report and at the map of Chinese operated or accessed ground stations, there were about a dozen, which we'll now say -1 because they're no longer operating out of Santiago, Chile.
About a dozen works though, right?
About a dozen, exactly. Yeah. A dirty dozen in 5 countries. And I'm imagining, and perhaps incorrectly after all that we've been discussing, that they have some sort of PLA presence if they're not outright managed by the special support force, or maybe I'm just wrong in that. I mean, I want our audience to understand clearly, why is this worrisome for the U.S. and possibly for defending the homeland?
Yeah, I'll take a stab at that. I mean, I think the question of whether those do have dual use applications or whether the PLA might have influence there or be using those facilities, I think something that we need to look into further, because I think this is all part of this process. I mean, Matthew and I, our team here for this report, dug in on a couple of these ground stations to look deep into them. But I think this fits into the broader picture of what China is doing in the region and around the world. I think for the U.S. specifically, the concern is we've seen from I think it was the commander of U.S. Southern Command raised the question about these specific space ground stations and what China could be doing, how they might be used for military intelligence and collection. One of the things that I think we point out in the report too is that in addition to having implications for the United States military that's operating in the region, I think one of the things that's important to me is thinking about how China engages with these countries in the region who are not playing on a level playing field with Beijing. So Beijing has so much money, it has so much influence that it's hard to say no to China for a lot of these governments that want to work with Beijing, but they're definitely not doing that on an equal footing. And so that's I think a big issue for the United States. I think we have, taken advantage of U.S. lasting influence in the region. And I think because of that, other countries have started to turn to China more for, economic support and for engagement across a lot of diplomatic political avenues. And I think the important thing for the United States to be able to do as we look at this region is to find ways to help these countries to operate with and to engage with China on a more equal footing, to encourage China to be more accountable and transparent about what it's doing, so that, in future contracts, maybe they're not saying that the Argentinian government can't have any influence or any activities around these facilities. So I think that's been a big concern for me as we write about this. Matthew, I don't know if you had any thoughts.
No, I think that that's exactly right. In terms of, yeah, I think maybe there's two sort of sides to this, right? One is that we, again, when we think about foreign militaries, we probably, our frame of reference is the U.S. military, where we make really clear distinctions in the U.S. when someone is a military officer or not. The PLA has a lot of people and a lot of personnel, and PLA personnel can slide in and out of lots of different organizations and entities, whether those are companies, those are political organs. People can have a PLA affiliation in some way or the other. And so even in cases, and this extends beyond ground stations, where you might have a civilian entity or a company or an SOE operating in some sort of seemingly civilian or commercial environment, members of their board might be, associated closely with the PLA. They could be affiliated with the PLA in ways that information is trickling back from there directly into the military. And that's just on the human level, right? That's just like what one person could potentially do. So it's hard. It's just hard to understand. But I think Brian's exactly right. Like, what does the U.S. do? The U.S. should not be in this game of trying to, counter everything that China is doing. And it's not the right thing. It's very reactive. And especially in this region, I'd argue the U.S. has kind of neglected South America, right? Just taken for granted that the U.S. is the preeminent power, and that countries are going to look to the U.S. when they're looking for an outside foreign power, as a for whatever variety of reasons it is. And so, what should the U.S. do? Well, the U.S. needs to re-engage, right? We have so many tools for diplomatic engagement. We have so many tools for soft power engagement that countries want. And we need to demonstrate that, right? There needs to be that kind of effort. And to me, that's the best possible counter you could have to any of the stuff we're talking about, or anything else when it comes to potential dual use applications of whatever it is in South America. Is, well, the U.S. has to do something, and the U.S. really has to come to the table with something to offer.
Gentlemen, Matthew, Brian, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. This has been fun. Thank you so much for having it on. We really enjoyed it.
Yeah, it's great to be with you.
That's it for this week. If you like what you're hearing, follow the Downlink on Twitter and subscribe to the podcast on your favorite podcast platform. For the latest defense news and analysis, listen to the Daily Defense and Aerospace Report podcast hosted by Vago Muradian, and listen to Cavis Ships to hear the latest on what's happening in the maritime domain. I'm Laura Winter, and thank you for listening.